I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon, live from Sweden, by PeO Hedvall, or PeO, as introduce him. Is professor at it's Lund University in Sweden. Yes, yes, and I've started. Well, I kind of came across Parallel on LinkedIn, and he's done some fantastic articles, I think, that explain what universal design is and how it can be implemented and used I suppose, as just a general way of designing things better. But I think he will explain it much better than I'm doing. So I'll hand over to PeO to take us through his creating a society beyond us and them.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for the nice introduction. My name is PeO Hedvall, and I work as a professor in design at Mid Sweden University. And what I'm going to talk about today is, as Paul said, it's all about universal design and how to create a society beyond us and them. Because that's something that I work a lot with, that we have a society where we have a strong established norm, and then those who are understood as deviating from the norm. And that creates an us and a them, and that we see popping up in buildings, in policy frameworks, in graphics, etc. So I'm going to give some examples from our research, but also tell a bit from my own life and situations that I've been part of. I've been using a wheelchair for more than 35 years now. So I often use situations that I've been part of when I talk about accessibility, usability, and universal design. So we'll start with a personal story to introduce universal design, and from there I will move on to discuss categorization and norm and deviation, and how those create us and them in different contexts, and with discussing universal design as part of developing culture. On the screen now, there's a photograph that I took in Italy at a conference a couple of years ago. It's a toilet door with a wheelchair sign where someone has peeled off the wheel, so it's just a sitting person left. And I got interested in that, and I wish I was there when were there when the person took away the wheel. I would have liked to ask that person why they did it, and what their thoughts behind it was. This wheelchair sign is something that we see all around society, but sometimes it's a bit double-edged. While it signals trust and care, it also highlights certain individuals, and this is something that I work with in our research. But let's start with a situation that I've been part of. On the screen now, there's a photograph from a brand new building in the city of Lund in Sweden. And I'm visiting the building for the first time. I've just entered the building, and when I enter the building, I'm greeted by a large landscape, a staircase that is sort of at the center of the building. And then tucked away in the corner to the left, that's where the elevators are. And when I entered this building, I was going to the third floor, since I was about to teach occupational therapy students about universal design. So I needed to find an elevator. But when I saw this, when I saw this building and when I experienced it, I recognized it, since it's something that I've been seeing many times before. And it's almost like a trend right now to build buildings around so-called social staircases, where people are supposed to mingle, have their lunches, etc. But it also creates an established norm, and it centers around those who can use the staircase. and while the elevators are often tucked away in much darker corners. So there's a norm, and then there's those deviating from the norm, and which are the ones who need to find an elevator. And one main reason why I like to work with universal design as a design approach is that from a universal design point of view, there is only one population. And in that population, there are variations and differences in vast richness of humanity. But we don't have a normal population and then those deviating from that. From a universal design point of view, there's only one population. And everything that we create as human beings becomes part of its time. And it's sort of the zeitgeist, the values that rubs off on what we create. So in this case, this building, it has embedded values such as attitudes, norms, expectations, who are expected, who are not, who's expected to do what in different situations. And this is the way I see design as a whole, that it's not just something that is external from you that you can knock on, and it is part of something that you experience. It is part of an integral part of your life. On the screen now, there's a child leaning out of a train car. And when she was born, there's much of society's and its design that she hadn't met yet. But as she grows up and rubs against society and grows into society, society also grows into her. Take the alphabet, for instance. When she was born, she hadn't met the alphabet. But the alphabet is an artifact. It's something that is designed. It is something that can look different in different cultures. But as she grows up, many children learn to read and write and start to contribute to society in that way as well. And as part of that process, the alphabet sort of grows into the person as well. So this is how I see design. It is part of us. It is just, and it's shaping who we can be, who we can become, and what stories about us that society support. So I often talk about the individual in the society, but also the society in the individual. And this connects to universal design. On the screen now is my favorite quote regarding universal design. And it is from the very start when universal design started to grow by Ron Mace, who was an architect who coined the universal design term. And he used it publicly first in an interior design magazine back in 1985. This is not from the magazine, but this is from an occasion where he spoke, I think. And on the screen now there's a quote saying, "Universal design is ultimately about changing attitudes throughout society, emphasizing democracy, equity, and citizenship. Universal design denotes a process more than a definite result." And the reason why I like this quote is because it isn't about ramps or slopes or contrast levels on web pages, etc. It is about democracy, equity, citizenship, attitudes. It is about societal change. And that's the way I see universal design, that it is ultimately about societal change. There are two main ideas that I come back to almost daily when it comes to universal design. And that is equity and flexibility. That's also the first and second principle of universal design. But that's not the main reason. I think that these two keywords are the two most important for universal design. So equitable use is about treating people with dignity, to not put people in vulnerable positions or to treat people as different. On the screen now, there are two photographs. On the top, there's two persons leaving a shopping mall. One is standing and one is sitting down. And there's an inbuilt flexibility in that door opener. It is aware that people are of different heights. Everyone has a height, but it's different. And that's the assumption behind that door opening mechanism. You don't have to be 1.82 meters to be let out. And we have a lot of flexibility in society. In most cases, we don't call it universal design. And that's just fine, I think. But say, for instance, there's also a photograph of an electric desk that can go up and down. And why do we need to have electric desks that can change in height? Well, because everyone has a height, but it's different. But also maybe we want to change position during the day, or depending on what activities we're involved in. And if we connect these two ideas, equity and flexibility, we get that flexibility opens up for diversity. But when you hear the term universal design, it sort of leads the mind to thinking about one size fits all. But it is actually totally the other way around, that we need flexibility. There is a variation in society, and there is a variation between humans, both single individuals, but also between each other. And the only reasonable response to that variation is to meet that with variation. So I often say that flexible use is about meeting variation with variation. In Sweden, universal design has been part of policy in different flavors for almost, say, about 20 years now. But the term universal design got a much stronger foothold after we ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But then it took about 10 years before the term universal design was actually became part of the Swedish policy frameworks. So on the screen now, there are two examples of Swedish policy frameworks. One is the National Disability Policy, which is about full participation, equitable living conditions, and so on. That's a national goal. But then there are 4 focus fields, or 4 focus areas. And the first one was for everything new, base it on universal design. And for the existing, continue to improve accessibility. And then the third one is about individual support. Even in the most open and inclusive society that I can think about, I will still need some way to move about in society. And there isn't a contradiction between universal design and individual support. We are going to need that anyway, always going to need that, some separate solutions. And the fourth point is to prevent discrimination at all times. So this was a national disability policy, but we also have a national policy for the design living environments. That's the national design and architecture policy framework, and also in there, which is much more general. It's about all architecture, all design. It says and promotes a systematic application of universal design. So just 2 examples of one from within the field of disability and one from outside of the field of disability. So in Sweden, we have 3 terms that we use when it comes to what creates the conditions for participation, who can go where, who can do what in what situations, contribute to what in society. And those 3 are accessibility, usability, and universal design. And even though each of them are important, I would say that the totality that the three create together is the most important. Sometimes there can be a bit of confusion between, so what's universal design and what's accessibility. And I think the most important thing is that we capture what's important, and not the exact term that we use for it. But here's how we define it in Sweden: that accessibility, that's the term that we've had for the longest time. It is about access. It is a measurable concept. So, and we have it as part of the national building legislation, for instance. And on the screen now, there are three bubbles where accessibility is the smallest one. And outside of that accessibility bubble, there's another bubble saying usability, which traditionally has three focus points: effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And that's the individual's or group's point of view. So if accessibility is more of an objective term, usability is more subjective. That's the individual's perspective. And now in the more recent years, we've added a third, the largest bubble, universal design, with a focus on equity and equality, non-stigmatization, so to avoid putting people in harm or harmful situations, or treating people as separate, and intersectionality, that a person is so much more than just how much they can happen to hear or see or can move about. And those three together, they create the conditions for participation. So let's take this model and use it on a concrete example. So here's a photo that I took a Thursday afternoon 2 years ago. It's on a train in the northern parts of Sweden. I have just embarked on a 2.5 hour train journey. And when I entered, it was a modern train, fairly new. I could roll in. There was level access to get in. I took left around a large toilet. So there was a large toilet. And behind that toilet, there was a space with a wheelchair sign where I was supposed to sit. And this is where I've taken the photograph inwards towards the train car. And where I sit, there's also a bicycle, there's a child sleeping in a pram, and there are some seats, but they are blocked by the bicycle. And then further into the car, there are comfortable seats with tables and power outlets, etc. So there's quite a stark contrast between the two compartments. And this is a situation that I love to talk with our design students about. And I often ask them my favorite question, which is, what do you notice in this situation? And quite often they say that it feels like you're sitting in the luggage compartment. And yeah, well, that was part of my experience. Something made me raise my cell phone and take this photograph. And it was the division between what is so-called normal passenger and the ones using the space where I'm sitting. I had planned to work during the train ride, but since it was expected to take 2.5 hours, but I didn't have a table and I didn't have a power outlet, so I couldn't work. So what if we take the three rings with accessibility, usability, and universal design and apply it on this situation? So what about accessibility? Well, I would say that this train car meets a lot of formal accessibility requirements. There was a level access, there was a large toilet, there was a space for me to sit. So I would say that from a pure accessibility point of view, it meets a lot of criteria. But what about usability? My lived perspective. Was it effective, efficient? Was I satisfied? Well, I wasn't particularly satisfied, and I couldn't do what I had planned to do. So usability, no, very poor usability, I would say. And what about universal design? What about equity and stigmatization and intersectionality? Well, I think it's quite clear that universal design hadn't at all been part of this design process. It is quite easy to see that you could have come up with a much more flexible layout of the train car if you have had universal design as a starting point. But there's a very strong us and them in this situation. So no universal design. So this is the way, and this is why all three terms are important to have, because they all three capture different things. So when we work with universal design, we're trying to understand and bring in and work together with, as then tease out variation in all its flavors. On the screen now, there's a bell curve, a population curve, where most people are in the middle, and then some people are at the outer edges of that curve. And there it says some people, and there's a vertical line denoting that some people are present and some are not. And among those who are not, I think it's always interesting to ask who doesn't work here, who doesn't study here, who doesn't eat here. So who have we left behind? We can learn a lot about participation from that point of view, but also who is present, but perhaps struggles a bit to be present. We can learn a lot about participation from that point of view as well. So I think those two focus points, foci, are important. Who is left behind and who is present, but just barely. And when working with universal design, it is about understanding as much as possible and having that as part of the design process, as about variation. Sometimes it's called extreme users or extreme situations. I think extreme users is perhaps a term that I don't use that often, since it depicts the users as being extreme. But I often talk about extreme situations instead. So one other thing that is good to have in mind when working with universal design is categorizations. And that's something that we do a lot of research on. So why categorizations? And what we use categorization as a verb rather than category, to emphasize that they are active processes. That categorization is always done to someone by someone. And since it's done to someone by someone, it also values certain perspectives and silences others, and gives advantages and disadvantages to people. But this is often done in an invisible way. So in our research, we ask questions like, how do categorizations operate? What do they create in terms of stigma and inequality? And who is understood to be part of all? That's just an example of questions that are on categorizations. So a couple of concrete examples of how we work with categorizations. Well, first of all, when I move about in society, I'm used to being put in the category of someone using a wheelchair, a disabled person, or a person with a disability, but depending on what language we use. On the screen now, there are three photographs. From one is a photograph from an airport in Italy, one airport in Spain, and one ferry to a Danish island. And all three those signs in the photographs carry wheelchair signs, but none of them use the standard wheelchair sign. So for instance, there's a seaman in a wheelchair on the ferry. But this is an example of how categorizations become, they flavor one situation and color the next one as well. So on the screen now, there are two photographs of two toilet doors. One thing that we've done in our research is to ask citizens to send us photographs of situations where they feel that they belong, or where they are alienated or feel experienced as being excluded. And a surprising amount of those have been on toilet doors. So that, and on the screen now, there are two such photos of toilet doors. To the left, there are three pictograms on a toilet door: a person in a wheelchair, a family consisting of a child, mom and dad, and then there's a standing person changing diaper on a baby. So what happens here in terms of categorization? Well, they tell about which persons or which roles or what bodies, who is expected to use this room. To the right, there's another type of pictogram, also a toilet door, but with a water closet and two handrails. So that one doesn't say anything about who this room is for. It tells about what kind of room is it, and maybe what are the facilities, and what is the layout of this room. Is it a broom closet, or is it a toilet? And if so, what functionality is in that room? So here's a shift from left to right. So this is one of the patterns that we've found in our research, that when we go from telling who is this for, to function or layout or situation instead. And we call that pattern from person to function. Another example is to go from norm and deviation, which I've talked about a lot in this presentation, to variation. On the screen now, again, two photographs. To the left is a photograph of an entrance to a coffee shop it's from a fairly new built area in the city of Gothenburg in Sweden. And there's a difference in height, say 12, 15 centimeters to get into the coffee shop. And they've solved that with one step and a very long ramp that you have to go around if you come with a pram, or if you use a wheelchair, or deliver a package or whatever. So it creates an totally unnecessary us and them in this situation, because it's not fully visible in the photograph, but there's plenty of space outside, and they could have worked with just the paving and raised the paving a bit, and then they would, then they wouldn't have had this ramp or this step. But this is how we are primed to do things. First, we solve things for the norm, and then we handle the deviations separately. So when I saw this photograph the first time, I thought that, okay, so here's the norm and deviation pattern that has struck again. But to the right, there's a very simple example of how to meet variation with variation. It's a bench in the city of Kalmar in Sweden. The bench, as I said, is a very simple example, but the bench has cutouts in the seat. It has seats with armrests and backrests, and seats without. So there's a variation in seating options. And so this is, to me, a better example when it comes to meet variation with variation. And so how to meet human variation with seating variation in this instance. So I hope that through the force of universal design and the growth of universal design, that we are a part of experiences shifting in culture. And one thing that I think is important to establish and contribute to that shift is to not only talk about tools and methods, but we also need to think about processes, mindsets, and culture. So on the screen now, there's another figure with 5 circles on top of each other. The smallest one, the innermost, it says tools, but those tools are part of the next circle, methods. And those methods, they are part of the next circle, processes. But what about the processes? Well, they are part of mindset. And the mindset, what allows the mindset to grow and change and transform over time? Well, that's the outermost circle, the culture. And this is my hope for universal design, that it can contribute to a future that is better at meeting variation with variation, and not relying as much on us and them thinking. So the main takeaways from this short presentation is that universal design means treating people with dignity, equity, meeting variation with variation, flexibility, and that all 3 terms, accessibility, usability, and universal design, are needed, since they capture different things, and one can't replace the other. And that we need to move beyond thought patterns based on norm and deviation, and instead of by exploring and shifting categorization. So how we categorize, explore shifting categorization beyond us and them. Here are some references to some of the things that I've talked about. And also, as Paul said, I have a newsletter on LinkedIn where I try to write short essays or articles about situations that I've been part of and analyze them from universal design point of view. And it can be other things, but it is mostly about universal design.
Thank you for that. I think I'm sure that was a kind of really interesting different way to think about kind of how to design the world, I think, isn't it? And have you done any work with? 'Cause I think a lot of those examples were kind of public infrastructure and obviously kind of trains and kind of public buildings. Have you done any work on kind of housing in Sweden or kind of more widely, and some of your thoughts maybe on how homes could kind of feature some of these kind of principles and be kind of more usable and kind of universal design as well?
Well, I think the mindset that I'm talking about, I think that is just as relevant when it comes to homes as well. Then homes can be so different. I mean, if it's a student apartment where people move in and out frequently, or then an increased flexibility, where you can sort of shift from one person to the next. It becomes quite natural that each person that moves into a student apartment will perhaps have different demands. But if I take the Swedish situation, I would say that if I try to find a home, say that I am getting a job at a new university and I'm about to move, then there's only a smaller portion of the homes that are available to me and my family to move into. So the way I think about this, everything new we create, we need to be very mindful about creating maximum variation because this will be part of the whole. And after that, all of the available homes. But sometimes there's a bit debate: should all student housing be accessible, for instance? Well, it's still the case that most student housing isn't as accessible. So even though if we build everything new fully accessible, then it's not the whole. Not all student housing is still accessible. Um, but I think that the us and them, and moving from us and them to a variation kind of way of thinking, I think that's something that I find helpful also in ICT, for instance. Well, it isn't tied to a separate particular design field as such.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. It kind of applies more generally. Have you kind of seen an improvement in architecture and kind of the way it incorporates universal design? Are you kind of seeing that perhaps in kind of Sweden or more internationally that there is greater recognition of kind of variability and not kind of designing with the ramps and steps that you kind of showed?
It isn't moving very fast, but I think it's different in different countries. Norway, for instance, they've had universal design as part of their legislation since 1997. So they're a bit ahead of us Swedes in that respect. There's a lot of interesting. Denmark, in my opinion, was lagging behind Sweden for a while, but now in last 5 years or so, there's just a lot of interesting things happening in Denmark, and also from a more, it doesn't always grow from a disability rights perspective, more that an understanding of that these are values that are important for all architecture, and we need to talk about it as design and architecture, not as design for disabled, for instance. Yeah, and in Denmark, I would say that there's an interesting process going on right now in the architecture business as a whole, rather than just the already the those who already uh, have bought the idea of universal design.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Thank you. That was I found that fascinating. And if you're kind of happy to hang around for a little, I'm sure there'll be some more questions a little bit later. But thank you for now, PeO Hedvall from Mid Sweden University.